video is going to be on some general number sense tips and tips for how to take the test. So before we get into that, let's just start by going over the rules, because once you understand the rules, then you can understand the strategy to take when you are approaching the test. So just for scoring, the first thing to know is that it's +5 for a correct answer. And unlike some other tests, it is points off for skipping or guessing or incorrect answers on number sense. Each one of those, skipping, guessing, is -4, so for incorrect or blank. And other thing to note is that if you only answer till a question say 45, then the rest of those questions from 45 to 80 aren't going to be counted as blank. They're just counted as not attempted. So you won't get -4 for those. It's only if you skip questions in the questions you attempted. So say I answered questions 1 to 45, but within that I skipped questions 7 and 9, then yes, those would be counted -4. But 46, 47, and all that you don't get penalized for. So it's just important to keep those rules in mind. But with that aside, we can get into the tips. And my first tip is to not be afraid to skip questions. So I know I just talked about how it is a point deduction if you do skip questions, but if you're looking at a question and you think it'll take you more than 30 seconds, I would recommend to just skip it, because number sense is 80 questions in 10 minutes. So that basically gives you 7.5 seconds per question if you're trying to get through the whole test. And by no means do you need to get through the whole test, but it's still helpful to keep in mind the time that you should be spending for each question. So even if your goal is 60 questions, you would only have 10 seconds per question. And obviously some questions will take you less time, some might take you a few seconds and some might take you 20. And that's fine. I just recommend that if you look at a question and you think it'll take 30 seconds, just skip it, because your time can be better spent elsewhere. And honestly, yes, you will lose points, but if you get the next question right, you'll have already made this up. So it's really not a big deal to skip a question here and there. I know that I used to be kind of hesitant to skip questions, but it can really waste your time and prevent you from getting to more questions. All right, so my second tip is, once you've written an answer, just move on. And this might seem kind of obvious, because in number sense, you can't erase, you can't cross out. The judges, they won't look at any of that. But sometimes when you're taking the test, it's kind of hard to remember that, and it's pretty natural to have the urge to look back at your previous question and oh wait, was that right? Or try to fix it. But there's no point in doing this in number sense, because like I said, they won't look at this at all. So you just have to kind of remember that when you're taking the test, because it's different than a typical test, but still, this is really important to keep in mind for number sense. If you do this, you'll just end up wasting time. So just remember that and try to focus on only the question at hand, because otherwise you're just going to be wasting your time. So my third tip is to pay attention to the specified format of the answer. So many questions on number sense will tell you the format they want for the answer. So for example, they might say mixed number, improper fraction, or decimal, things like that. And so it's just important that you look at this before you write down your answer. Otherwise, you might end up getting it wrong simply because of the format. For example, if you write down 1/4 as 0.25, you might get that counted wrong if they say to write as a fraction. So it really sucks to lose points for small things like that. So just make sure you're looking at the format of the answer before you write anything, because they usually put the format to the right of the answer blank. So you might forget to look at that. But just keep this in mind, because we don't want to lose easy points here just for format. So just make sure you pay attention to that. My fourth tip is that it's okay to not get to all the questions. Don't stress yourself out trying to finish every last question, because sometimes it's not the best strategy for everyone. Because obviously, while speed is important in number sense, it's not worth it to work through the whole test only to have really poor accuracy. Because remember, you lose 4 points for an incorrect answer, which is a pretty substantial amount. So it's best not to just rush through the test. For example, if you answer all 80 questions, but you miss 15, that'll get you the same score as answering 68 questions correctly. This is also especially important because The questions on number sense get harder as you go, so you don't want to rush through questions that are kind of easier and that you could get right if you just spent the appropriate amount of time on them, only to, you have time for the later questions, but those may be harder and you might not even be able to get them correct. So it's important to find a balance between speed and accuracy that works for you. And it's really okay not to get to all the questions. Like, most people don't get to all 80, or even like getting to 60 is really good. So I just keep that in mind. It's important to have the correct mindset when you're taking the test and not just rush through it. And my fifth and final tip is to be careful about estimation questions. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, on number sense, every 10th problem is a question which requires an approximate answer. And so you'll be counted correct so long as you're within 5% of the correct answer. So this is a pretty substantial margin, but you still need to be quite careful when you're estimating. So for instance, when I'm doing estimation questions, I'll often round the numbers in the problem so that it's a little bit easier to do and so that I can, still do it in a good time. But you need to be careful on what numbers you're rounding and the scale of the question when you're rounding, because sometimes if you round a number, it can affect your answer too much depending on what you're doing with the number. So like, for example, if I'm adding 124 to 1798 and that's the estimation question, it's really not a big deal if I round down 124 to 120 or maybe even 100, because all we're doing is adding this to a substantially larger number, so it's really not going to have a huge effect on your answer. But by contrast, if I'm trying to estimate something like 124 to the third, it's much more appropriate to round 124 to 125, because if I round to 100, my answer would be way too small, but even if I round to 120, I'll still be out of the range. So really, like, the appropriate thing to do here would be to round it to 125. And the reason you can't round as much for this question is because 124 cubed is 124 times 124 times 124. So rounding just a little bit will have a big effect on the answer because you're multiplying this number by itself. So it's just important to keep in mind what exactly you're doing with the number, because that'll determine how much it's okay for you to round it. So just be mindful of that when you're taking a number sense test and when you come across these estimation questions. So that's all for this video. I hope these tips help, and thanks for watching.